These videos simply provide a presentation in video format of the book, Predator at the Chessboard by Ward Farnworth. The book is freely available online at http://www.chesstactics.org. Black to move. What is the best move? Inspect for checks black can give with his bishop. This turns up bishop moves to d4. Does the move attack anything else? Yes, white's queen at b6. Since the queen can attack the bishop, the fork only works if the bishop has protection on d4. It does, from the black rook on d8. So bishop moves to d4 trades the bishop for white's queen. Now try seeing the pattern by scanning the geometry of white's pieces. It is important in a position like this to notice right away that white's king and queen are on the same diagonal. Again, it will help to take away two types of lessons from these positions: conceptual points, trains of thought that lead to the forks, and visual patterns that you will be able to recognize in your games. Black to move. What is the best move? Loosening the forking square. What checks does black's bishop have? Bishop moves to d4. Look to see what else the move does and note that it attacks the loose rook at a7. So there is a potential bishop fork at d4, but the square is protected by the knight at b3. So of course you look to take the knight and thus play rook takes knight. The response pawn from a2 takes rook follows, and after the exchange d4 has become a loose square. Black safely plays bishop moves to d4, check. White's king moves, and black takes the rook. All this is familiar from our prior work on double attacks. But notice the different visual look of this position. See the white rook and king stretched out along the same diagonal, and realize that this signals a forking possibility. As discussed earlier, a rook often can make a good target for a bishop fork whether it is protected or not. Here, however, the fork worked only because the rook was unprotected. The reason, which is common, is that the fork required a sacrifice by black in the first place here, a sacrifice of his rook for a knight. To justify that sacrifice, the fork that it creates has to make a big score. Taking a rook for nothing makes it worthwhile. Taking a rook that had protection, and then losing the bishop, would have made the combination a wash. White to move. What is the best move? Almost the same. White has a check with his bishop in bishop takes at d5. The move also attacks the loose rook at a2. The d5 pawn is protected by the knight at b6, but the knight can be captured with rook takes knight, pawn from a7 takes rook, leaving the forking square loose. White plays 2. Bishop takes at d5, check. King moves to h8, and then 3. Bishop takes rook. That is how the position comes apart under interrogation about its targets, but notice as well that visually it is almost identical to the previous one, the only difference is that a black pawn lies between the king and rook. It is important not to let an obstruction like that prevent you from seeing that the king and rook are on the same diagonal. Look through the pawn as you trace the lines on the board with your eyes. White to move. What is the best move? What visual pattern do you see? Black's king and knight on the same diagonal, this suggests that conditions may be right for a fork. Bishop moves to d5, check. Almost does it, but the rook at d3 protects both the forking square and the targeted knight. White can't capture the rook, so he proceeds by asking if he might capture the knight with some other piece, thus attracting the rook onto the knight's square when it recaptures and leaving it loose. He can. One rook takes knight, rook takes rook both loosens the forking square and creates a loose target. Now bishop moves to d5, check. Forks and wins the rook. White to move. What is the best move? Loosening the target and forking square. We now consider a common pattern that is a variation on the theme just considered. Often a possible bishop fork has a pair of problems: the piece it would target is protected, and the piece also guards the forking square. This most frequently happens when the target of the potential fork is a bishop or pawn. The solution then is to perform an exchange with one of your other pieces that trades the bishop or pawn for a better target, one that is loose and that cannot fire back at your own bishop when it executes the fork. An illustration will make the point clearer. Recall our current drill: look for any enemy pieces lined up on the same diagonal, and especially for pieces lined up on the same diagonal as the king. Here Black's king and bishop are aligned. The bishop won't work as a target for a bishop fork, it is protected and it can attack the forking square. But seeing the geometry still can provide an idea to motivate your examination of forcing moves. A common way to deal with an unsuitable target is by capturing it with another piece, allowing a recapture, and then executing the fork against its replacement. So the solution here is the preliminary exchange rook takes bishop. If Black responds with rook takes rook, Now the bishop has been replaced with a rook that is loose and that cannot guard the forking square. Bishop moves to c5, check. Wins back the rook and nets a bishop. White to move. What is the best move? The initial visual clue here is about the same as in the previous problem, see it, or simply ask what checks white's bishop has. There is bishop moves to g6, attacking nothing else, and bishop moves to c6, attacking the bishop at b7, an unsuitable target that also guards the forking square. So again white exchanges the unsuitable target for a suitable one by capturing it and inviting recapture by black. One rook takes bishop, knight takes rook, and the bishop has been replaced by a knight that is loose and that cannot defend c6. Now 2. Bishop moves to c6, check. Picks up the knight, winning 2 pieces for a rook. Black to move. What is the best move? Here is a position nearly the same as the previous ones, but involving a triangular pattern rather than a single diagonal. Still, ask the same questions, get comparable answers. Black plays 1. Rook takes bishop, 2. Rook takes rook, bishop takes at f4, check. Forking white's king and rook and netting a piece and a pawn. White to move. What is the best move? The salient visual point is that black's king, bishop, and rook all are lined up on the same diagonal. There is work to do before this can be turned into an effective fork, but the idea that will motivate your inquiry is clear. Bishop takes at c5 attacks the black rook and aims the bishop at the black king. The black bishop on e7 is the only obstacle to a winning fork, it guards the forking square and blocks the line to the king. As usual, the remedy is an exchange of the bishop for a better target. 1 rook takes bishop, king takes rook, 2. Bishop takes at c5, check. Forks king and rook and again wins a piece and a pawn. Black to move. What is the best move? What checks does black have with his bishop? Bishop takes knight, check. The move also attacks a pawn at b4, and a protected one at that, and the pawn guards the square anyway, along with the white rook. So there is nothing here yet, but if you at least see this much you will have the idea in hand and can use standard techniques to build a little combination out of it. Black takes the pawn with another piece, 1, rook takes at b4, and now if 2. Rook takes rook, black plays bishop takes knight, check. And wins back the rook with the gain of a piece and a pawn. In the actual game white replied to. Rook moves to a5, bishop takes knight, check. 3. Rook takes bishop, rook moves to f4, check. Another double attack, this time against white's king and f-pawn, 4. King moves to e3, rook takes at f5 and black was 2 pawns ahead. White to move. What is the best move? Moving the king into position, etc. As you no doubt are noticing, the tools required to create bishop forks are the same used to create many forks by the queen and some by the knight. Here, as in those other cases, there often may be a forking square that needs to be loosened. The techniques for loosening it, e.g., a preliminary capture of the piece that currently sits on the square, or of the guardian of it, are the same regardless of whether the goal is to put a bishop, queen, or knight on the square. It would be possible just to leave it at that, but for the sake of building pattern recognition skills it will be worthwhile to see at least a few examples of how these processes look in the context of double attacks by the bishop. And in any event the thought process is not quite the same. In this section we consider cases where the bishop has no way to give a check, but where with some work you can build a fork that involves an attack on the enemy king at one end. The crucial initial question is how you would realize there is an opportunity for such fork building in the first place. If the bishop has no checks, what would cause you to try to create a fork involving one? The answer, of course, is that you look for any other pieces the bishop can threaten that would form good targets for a double attack. Having found one, you then go to work to create a check at the other end. We saw that in the queen's case this generally meant that you had to find or create a loose piece to attack, because a queen can't afford to attack anything that is protected. One of the pleasures of attacking with the bishop, however, is that its list of good targets is longer, thus these positions require you to start by considering carefully whether the bishop can threaten any loose pieces, or rooks, or queens. These problems may require you to keep developing some new habits. If you are not an experienced player, you probably are accustomed to asking what pieces your bishop, or your other pieces, can capture on the next move, but not what pieces your bishop can threaten on the next move, and thus capture in 2 moves. But that is the important question here, as it often was in the earlier chapters. In the bishop's case, the examination of possible threats is pretty easy because the movements the piece makes are limited and easy to follow. It also simplifies the task to remember that any possible targets of the bishop must sit on the same color square that it does. The visual patterns we used to set the analytical process in motion in the last section may be a little less helpful here, because at the beginning of these positions the king and the target piece tend not to be on the same diagonal or triangle. You still may be able to see that the king almost is aligned with another piece, and so have the idea of moving them into alignment with each other. Even if you don't see that, the key patterns emerge here after an initial exchange or two, and much the point of mastering the relevant visual patterns is to be able to recognize them not just at the beginning of a position but as they emerge after you have imagined initial forcing moves and responses in your mind's eye. Turning to the position on the left, what black pieces can white's bishop attack? We do not just ask what black pieces are loose, because a more valuable enemy piece may be a good target for a bishop even if it is protected. Answer: it can attack the rook by moving to d2 or d4. Threatening a rook is a nice start, but becomes really interesting only if it also is accompanied by another threat in a different direction, i.e., if it is part of a fork. So what other threat can be engineered into existence? Bishop moves to d4 aims the bishop in the king's general direction. If the king could be moved onto the same diagonal as the rook, white would have a double attack. What checks does white have that force the king to move? Only one. Pawn from f4 moves to f5, check. Carefully consider black's options in response. He can move the king to e5 or f6, there is nothing else. Either move puts the king into the path of the white bishop once it moves to d4+, and after the king then moves again, bishop takes the rook. Black can recapture with his other rook, but white wins the exchange. White to move. What is the best move? What black pieces can white's bishops attack? Not what can they capture, but what can they threaten by moving. Bishop moves to f5 attacks the rook at e4. The other rook is loose, but the dark squared bishop can't reach any squares from which to attack it. The light squared bishop would have a fork if black's king somehow could be moved onto g6. The simplest way to move the king is with checks, and white has two. The first is rook moves to f5, but this will not necessarily achieve the desired end. Black can play king moves to h6 or king moves to g6, king moves to g6 sets up a fork, but white can't pull the trigger because his own rook is then on the square that his bishop needs. White's other check is bishop moves to c1, check. Another study in the importance of remembering backward moves. Black would have to either move the king to g6, thus walking into the fork bishop moves to f5, check. And losing the rook, or he could try his only interposition, rook moves to e3, blocking the check. But then white plays bishop takes rook and wins the exchange. So 1. Bishop moves to c1, check. Wins regardless. White starts out ahead in that he has two pieces for black's rook, After winning the exchange he is ahead by a whole piece. White to move. What is the best move? What pieces can White's bishop threaten? Bishop takes at d5 attacks the rook on a8 and aims the bishop at Black's king. Or a visual way to assess the position is that it is a classic example of a king and rook triangle that lends itself to a fork at d5. Either way you look at it, the trouble is that the pawn on e6 blocks the way to the king and guards d5 as well. The point is clear, the pawn must be vacated from that square. Moving an enemy pawn off a square is best done by capturing something it protects. Here it protects the knight at f5, so 1. Rook takes knight, 2. Pawn from e6 takes rook does the trick. Now bishop takes at d5, check. Safely attacks king and rook, picking up the latter next move and netting a piece. White to move. What is the best move? White's bishop can't give a check and can't safely threaten anything. But it can make a capture, bishop takes at d5. Don't just reason that it loses a piece to bishop takes bishop, look for patterns that might form the basis of a tactical idea. On d5 the bishop would be aimed at Black's king and rook, though its path to each piece is blocked. Again, a visual way to see the tactical possibility is to note the classic king and rook triangle that would lend itself to a fork at d5 if only the white rook and black bishop could be cleared out of the way. Pick either obstacle and think about how to get rid of it. If you start with the rook at b7, you need it to vacate its square in a violent fashion that requires a response and gives the enemy no time to regroup. The obvious solution is a capture, rook takes bishop, to which black replies king takes rook, which takes care of both problems. Now bishop takes at d5, check. Wins the rook. Or start your thinking with the black bishop at f7. The natural way to get rid of it is by capturing it, and the only way to do so is with rook takes bishop, which again leads to king takes rook and the bishop fork from d5. White to move. What is the best move? This one is a step up in difficulty. What can white's bishop do? Its checks don't seem to lead anywhere, but there are other attacking possibilities to consider as well. Bishop moves to g5, attacking the black bishop, barely worth noticing because it's a useless target. Bishop moves to d2, attacking the black rook, and bishop takes at b6, attacking rook and bishop. This last move has the appealing look of a double attack, but again the bishop is an unsuitable target. This may be as far as you can go with initial reconnaissance. What you know is that, a. White has no double attack as yet, b. If he is to make one, the most plausible place for it probably would be b6, and, c. A fork there might be doable if the black king somehow could be moved onto the diagonal leading away from the rook toward d8. The next step is to experiment with whatever other checks white has available. The only check white can give with another piece is rook moves to d1, check. How would black respond? If he plays king moves to e6, white would be able to play rook takes bishop, the black bishop would be the victim of a skewer. To avoid this fate, black would need to move the king not to e6 but to a square where it can protect the bishop, either king moves to c7 or king moves to e7. Then what? Again, the pattern that would then exist probably would be easy enough to recognize if you encountered it as an initial matter. With bishop takes at b6, white has a double attack against the a5 rook and against either the bishop on d8, if black moved his king to e7, or against the king itself, if it was moved to c7. The fork still isn't quite there. White needs to perfect it by substituting the black king for the black bishop with rook takes bishop, to which black responds king takes rook. Now bishop takes at b6 at last wins the rook. White to move. What is the best move? What can white attack with his bishop? Bishop moves to e4 attacks a knight, which might make a good start for a double attack if the knight were loose, but it is protected by the rook at d8. Nor would the bishop then be attacking anything else. Still, the sight of the bishop attacking an enemy piece while also aimed at h7 should stimulate your imagination. If a loose piece could be substituted for the knight, and if the king could be pushed onto h7 as it was in some earlier problems, white would have a fork. So experiment a little with those possibilities. When a target is protected, one way to loosen it is to take it with another piece and allow for a recapture. Here, 1. Knight takes knight, rook takes knight, and white has half of a bishop fork in place. Next white turns to any checks that would force the king onto h7 and finds rook moves to a8. Remember that the black rook no longer would be on d8. After 2. Rook moves to a8, check. King moves to h7, white plays 3. Bishop moves to e4, check. And wins the rook. This is a position we already saw early in the chapter, where it was advanced to its last step. The point of repeating it here is to enable you to see what the same fork looks like a couple of moves away. Notice, too, that the sequence succeeds here only in the move order described, trying to move the king first, and then performing the exchange of knight for rook, would not have worked. So remember to look for your checks before and after you imagine captures you can make. Black to move. What is the best move? What can black's f5 bishop threaten? The two white pieces on light squares, the rook and knight, but not at the same time. The possible attacking moves are bishop moves to e6, bishop moves to e4, and bishop takes at c2. Attacking the rook with bishop moves to e4 has the interesting result of also attacking a square h1 next to white's king. In the previous problem this was exploited by forcing the enemy king onto the targeted square with a check. Here there is a different possibility. Consider the white king and the constraints on its movements. The back rank is owned by black's rook. If the bishop were attacking h1, rook moves to h1 would be made. So no setup is needed. Bishop moves to e4 threatens the rook and threatens rook moves to h1, checkmate. Thus winning the rook without any need to force white's king into a more vulnerable position. The lesson is to take notice if a bishop can attack both an enemy piece and a square next to the king. It may be that a preliminary exchange will allow you to move the king and so then check with the bishop move, or that aiming the bishop at that square will itself produce a mating threat that works just as well as a check as an anchor for the fork. White to move. What is the best move? Bishop forks of the king and queen. When your bishop makes the queen the target of a double attack, you can't generally count on a fork or other nifty maneuver to save the day when your opponent replies queen takes bishop. So typically a fork against the queen only works if the bishop has protection. Here are a few examples of how this looks. In the position on the left, white looks at his checks and sees that queen moves to d8 forces black's king to h7. He looks for his next check and finds bishop moves to f5, which forks black's king and queen but fails because black simply plays queen takes bishop. By then, white's queen no longer is on the fifth rank to supply protection. The fork would work fine if only the bishop had a guard. But white can have it both ways by giving the check with a different piece, rook moves to b8. This likewise forces black's king and queen onto the same diagonal, and this time white wins with bishop moves to f5, check. Notice that the problem starts with black threatening checkmate by playing queen takes at g2. In the face of this threat it would be natural for white to think defensively, but as we know, sometimes the best defense is a good offense. White to move. What is the best move? We start with an open diagonal to black's king, and a black piece the bishop on the same line. Now look for checks white can give with his own bishop, and find bishop moves to e5, check. If the black bishop could be swapped out for a better target, white would have a nice double attack. So capture black's bishop with another piece, one rook takes bishop, queen takes rook, and now the scene is set for bishop moves to e5, check. Forking black's king and queen. The point of seeing the position here is that since the queen is the target, white's bishop needs protection on the forking square. It gets it from the f4 pawn. One of the many nice things about having a pawn in or near the center is that it can provide a protective anchor for a piece delivering a fork. White to move. What is the best move? What checks does white's bishop have? Bishop takes at e6. Does the move attack anything else? Yes, the bishop at d7, which is an unsuitable target. Or see it visually, we have a classic triangle between black's king, queen, and e6 pawn. The bishop can be understood as an inadequate target or as an obstruction. Either way, the natural next step for white is to capture the bishop with another piece, as with rook takes bishop. Then if black recaptures with queen takes rook, the board is prepared for bishop takes at e6, now with black's queen as the target. Like the bishop that it replaced, the queen is a problematic target because it can fight back against the forking piece, but unlike the bishop, the queen's value is enormous. So the fork works as long as white's bishop has protection when it delivers the fork. It does, it will be guarded by the white queen. Play therefore goes 1. Rook takes bishop, queen takes rook, 2. Bishop takes at e6, check. Queen takes bishop, 3. Queen takes queen, check. And now white has won a queen, a bishop, and a pawn in return for a rook and a bishop. Black to move. What is the best move? This time black has no bishop checks, except the useless bishop takes at f2, check, so just ask what else his bishops can attack. You see then that bishop takes knight threatens white's queen. The threat amounts to nothing yet because the bishop wouldn't be protected against queen takes bishop and because it has nothing else to attack at the same time. But the king is not far away, and if it could be moved onto h1, black would have a classic triangular fork with bishop takes knight. Consider any checks black can give and how they might change the board. There's b pawn from b6 takes at f2, which loses the piece, and then the more interesting queen takes at g3, check. Can white reply pawn from f2 takes queen? No, because the f2 pawn is pinned. White therefore would have to play king moves to h1. Now bishop takes knight attacks both king and queen, and thanks to the previous move by the queen, the bishop now would have protection at f3. So white responds to bishop takes knight with queen takes bishop, and black replies with queen takes queen, check. And what then? White has to move his king to h2. Moving it to g1 is also a possibility, but eventually leads to mate for black. Black keeps the offensive pressure on with bishop takes at f2. White has no appetizing options in reply. Black threatens to mate with queen moves to g3, check. Followed by queen takes at h3, checkmate. White can prevent this by using his rook to take the bishop on f2 or by playing rook moves to g1, but either way he loses the exchange. Seeing the initial forking idea here was the key point, but playing through the rest of the sequence in your mind's eye will be a useful exercise in extending your range of vision. In summary, then, here is the most likely sequence: 1. Queen takes at g3, check. 2. King moves to h1, bishop takes at f3, check. 3. Queen takes bishop, queen takes queen, check. 4. King moves to h2, bishop takes at f2, 5. Rook moves to g1, bishop takes at g1, check. 6. Rook takes bishop. White to move. What is the best move? A quick look at checks white can give with his bishop turns up. Bishop takes at d6. Does the move attack anything else? Yes, the knight at e5. The knight is protected by black's queen, though also attacked once already by white's knight on d3, which also protects the d6 pawn. So play with exchanges white can initiate and with the move orders made possible by the threat white already has against e5. A natural possibility to consider is 1. Knight takes knight, queen takes knight. This upgrades the target of the fork. It also leaves behind an open line of protection from the white queen to the forking square. Thus bishop takes at d6 now forks king and queen. Another way to see the idea here is to notice that the black pawn on d6 is pinned to its king by the bishop at a3, and to look for ways to exploit the pin by taking whatever the pawn protects and pursuing the consequences. Again, trains of thought like this will be the focus of our later study of pins. Black to move. What is the best move? Bishop forks of other pieces. What checks can black's bishop inflict? None, of course, not least because the bishop is on a light square and the king is on a dark one. But the king is just the best anchor for a fork, not the only one. You really are looking for a square where your bishop might be able to attack any two vulnerabilities at the same time. Here the bishop can move to c6 and attack white's b7 knight and h1 rook, both of which are on the same light squared diagonal and both of which are loose. Black wins the knight. If you step back from the board and look for visual patterns, the alignment of white's knight and rook with nothing between them should be conspicuous. Use these studies to gain the habit of spotting enemy pieces like these that are on the same line, not to mention loose. Black to move. What is the best move? Black has no bishop checks, bishop moves to c5 obviously would be unsafe, but it's irrelevant because the bishop is pinned. Think more broadly about threats he might make with the piece. White's bishop, knight, rook, and queen all are on light squares, and so is black's e4 bishop. The queen and rook are on a common diagonal and so can be attacked with bishop moves to c6. When a bishop forks the enemy queen it requires protection, as we know, it has the needed cover here from its own queen at c1. Black thus wins the exchange. 1. Bishop moves to c6, 2. Rook takes bishop f8 plus, rook takes rook. Or perhaps he wins a queen for a rook and a bishop. The result if play goes as follows: 1. Bishop moves to c6, 2. Queen takes bishop, queen takes queen, 3. Rook takes rook, king moves to g7, protecting the bishop. Or instead 2. Rook takes rook, bishop takes queen, 3. Rook takes bishop, check. Same basic result. Black to move. What is the best move? Black is confronted with a fork by white's bishop. He is about to lose the exchange to bishop takes rook f8. But instead of reaching to move the knight, think about black's own offensive options. Again he has no checks, but ask anyway what else his pieces can threaten. In this case his dark squared bishop can fork the white pieces also on dark squares, the knight and bishop. Step back and scan the diagonals and other lines for pieces lined up on them. The knight is loose, but of course the bishop is protected and anyway is an unsuitable target for a bishop fork. We handle this in the usual way: black takes the bishop with rook takes bishop, to which white replies rook takes rook. Now bishop moves to e5 picks up the knight next move, netting 2 minor pieces for a rook. Or perhaps things play out differently. The following sequence will take a bit of patience to follow. White can reply to 2. Black bishop moves to e5 by leaving his rook on d6 and instead playing knight moves to f5, taking his knight out of the fork and using it to give the rook protection. If black replies pawn from e6 takes knight, notice that white now has the rook fork. Rook moves to d5 attacking the loose black pieces that would then be on c5, the knight, and e5, the bishop. The pawn on e6 was guarding against this danger before it captured, in this variation, on f5. So instead of pawn from e6 takes knight, black would want to respond to knight moves to f5 with rook takes knight. Now white has the recapture pawn from e4 takes rook, but then black has bishop takes rook d6, with the fork at last paying off. He ends up with two minor pieces against white's rook. Now for extra credit, do you realize that the success of black's fork here depends on his knight at c5 and his pawns on b7 and e6? Let's consider why. First, once white is forked, he almost can move his rook both out of harm's way and into position to protect his knight by playing rook moves to d3. If this move were feasible, the fork would be foiled. It is not feasible only because d3 is attacked by black's knight. This pattern nevertheless illustrates once again the extra difficulties created by double attacks against two ordinary pieces rather than the king. You have to ask what mischief either of them could make in breaking out of the fork. And then notice, too, that the aforementioned black knight on c5 is loose. This makes it a vulnerable target, so you need to worry that white might break out of the fork and make a counter-attack against the knight. This almost is possible. Once white's rook is baited onto d6, it nearly can break out of black's subsequent bishop fork with rook moves to c6 or rook moves to d5, threatening the knight. But not quite, because both of those squares are guarded by black pawns. The lesson: we know that when you fork two enemy pieces, not the king, you need to ask whether one of those pieces might spoil the fork by rushing to the defense of the other, but consider as well whether one of the pieces in the fork might go off and make a threat against you elsewhere. White to move. What is the best move? White has a bishop check with bishop moves to d6, check. How would black respond? Probably with king moves to a8. Whenever you imagine a move that would force your opponent to move, and especially a move that would force him to move his king, imagine the position that would result and interrogate it with the same questions you might ask if it were the board in front of you. What black pieces would be loose? What pieces are aligned? Black's queen and rook, which indeed are already aligned from the start, and would then be forkable with bishop moves to c7. Since the queen is one of the targets, naturally we look to make sure the bishop will have protection. It will, from the rook at c4. This description suggests how looking at every check might have led to the fork. Another way to see it, though, is to step back and notice first black's queen and rook on the same diagonal, especially since they have no pieces between them. That pattern is a setup for a double attack by the bishop. The question then becomes whether you might maneuver the bishop into position, since it cannot get to c7 directly. When you want to make a preliminary move without giving your opponent time to defend against the fork you are creating, the preliminary move has to be forcing. A check is best. Conveniently, white's bishop can give a check on the way to c7 by stopping first at d6.